Wyoming Territory, October 1881. The sky is enormous here.
Not to welcome, to watch. That must be her.
One suitcase. That tells a story by itself.
Easy now, miss. Platform's slick.
She steps off the train carrying one suitcase.
There you are.
The train was 40 minutes late. Garrett Weston had known it would be. The telegraph from Laramie came through the night before. Something about a damaged coupling outside of Medicine Bow, delays expected through morning. He had read the message twice, folded it, put it in his coat pocket, and gone to bed at the usual hour. He arrived at the station 1 hour early anyway. He told himself it was habit. A man who ran cattle across 4,000 acres of Wyoming territory did not sleep past 5 and did not arrive anywhere late. That was simply how things were done. It had nothing to do with the occasion itself, nothing to do with the woman on the train, nothing to do with the fact that today was the first day in 4 years that anything about his life was going to be different. He stood at the far end of the platform with a cup of coffee that Mrs. Aldgate had pressed into his hands when he passed the rectory, and he watched the empty track disappear around the bend of the hill, and he did not speak to anyone. Redstone Creek had other ideas. By 8 o'clock, the platform held 30 people. By 8:30, it held closer to 50. They came with the particular energy of a town that had been discussing this event for 3 weeks and was now arriving to witness it in person. The women came first, in pairs and clusters, arranging themselves at strategic positions along the platform with the practiced ease of people who understood that proximity to an event determined how much you could report about it afterward. Lavinia Pruett took the center position without appearing to choose it, flanked by Margaret Osgood and Ruth Delacroix, both of whom followed Lavinia's social direction the way smaller vessels follow a ship into harbor. Reverend Aldgate stood near the station door with his wife, holding the careful dignity of people who were only present to offer a proper Christian welcome. Sheriff Tatum leaned against the far wall with his arms crossed, watching everything the way lawmen watched things, like he was waiting for something to go wrong. Garrett watched all of them without appearing to watch any of them. He was aware, in the precise way he was always aware of things that mattered on his land, that every person on this platform had an opinion about what was about to happen. He was also aware that none of those opinions were his concern. He had made a decision. He had acted on it through the proper channels. A woman was arriving on the morning train from Chicago, and he was going to drive her to the Weston Ranch, and they were going to work out the practical details of a practical arrangement, and that was the entirety of what today was. He believed this completely. He almost believed this completely. The truth, the part he did not examine because he had learned that some things held better when you did not examine them too closely, was that he had read Marin Hale's letters 11 times. Not the first letter, the formal introduction the Chesterfield Matrimonial Agency had forwarded along with the photograph. He had read that once, noted the basic information, set it aside. It was the 3 letters that followed, after he had written back expressing interest, and she had responded with something more than the agency's suggested format. Those were the ones he had read 11 times. She wrote about her father. Not about her father as a subject, not in the way a person mentions a family member to establish their credentials, but about what it had actually cost her to watch him die. 3 years of it. The slow kind. The kind where the person you are trying to save becomes someone different before they go, and you grieve them twice. She wrote about the debts that accumulated while she was too busy keeping him alive to keep anything else in order. She wrote about burying him in a borrowed suit with $7 in her purse and no family left to stand beside her at the grave. She wrote about walking into the Chesterfield Matrimonial Agency on a Tuesday afternoon because it was the only door she could see. She did not write about what she wanted. Not once across 3 letters did she mention a single thing she was hoping for, dreaming of, reaching toward. She wrote only about what she owed, what she had done, what circumstances required of her. Garrett had read those letters 11 times because they were the truest thing he had encountered in 4 years. A woman who wrote only about obligation and duty and the weight of other people's needs, and never once about her own, was either completely selfless or completely exhausted, and he suspected from the particular flatness of her prose that she was both. He had also read what his contact in Denver had written about the Chesterfield Agency, about its photographs, about the general understanding among men who had used its services that the images submitted by female applicants were, as his contact put it, approximate. He had filed that information alongside the photograph of the young woman with soft features and fashionable hair, and had made the decision that the photograph was not the point. The letters were the point. The train arrived at 9:40 with a great exhalation of steam and the grinding complaint of brakes, and the platform stirred the way crowds stir when the moment they have been anticipating finally comes. Doors opened along the length of the train. Passengers descended. A family with 4 small children, the youngest crying with the sustained commitment of a child who has been traveling too long. 2 men in business suits who moved immediately toward the station interior, an elderly woman who stood at the top of the steps and waited with imperial patience for someone to assist her down, and then she stepped off. Marin Hale came down the train steps carrying a single suitcase with both hands, managing its weight with the careful deliberation of someone accustomed to doing difficult things without assistance. She wore a plain blue dress, practical and clean, without any particular claim to fashion. Her brown hair was pinned up neatly and without ornamentation. She was slight in the way of someone who had worked hard and eaten simply for most of her life, and her face was the kind of face that you would not have been able to describe with confidence 10 minutes after seeing it. Not because there was anything wrong with it, but because its quality was not the obvious kind. She stepped onto the platform and looked around with the direct, unhurried attention of a person taking in a new situation and cataloging it accurately. The whispers started within seconds. Lavinia Pruett did not lower her voice the way a person lowers their voice when they intend to be private. She lowered it the way a person lowers their voice when they intend to be heard by everyone in a 12-foot radius, while maintaining the ability to later claim they were only speaking to their companions. She's not pretty enough for a man like him. The words traveled the length of the platform with the ease of words spoken in spaces designed to carry sound. Marin Hale was 30 feet away when they were said. She was 15 feet away by the time Lavinia's companion whispered something in agreement. The platform was not large. Garrett watched her hear it. This was the thing he had not expected to observe, the precise moment when a person receives information they have received many times before and makes the decision, somewhere beneath the surface of their expression, about how they are going to carry it. Marin Hale's face did not change. Her pace did not alter. She continued walking toward him with the same steady, unapologetic stride she had used coming down the train steps. But something happened in her eyes. A person would have had to be paying very close attention to see it. Nobody on that platform was paying the right kind of attention. Something closed, the way a door closes when someone pulls it firmly from the inside, the particular expression of someone who has heard those exact words before and decided long ago to keep moving regardless. Garrett saw it. He had not expected to see anything. He had expected to assess the situation practically, determine whether the woman seemed capable and honest, and proceed accordingly. He had not expected to see someone absorb a wound without showing the wound. Marin stopped in front of him and set the suitcase down on the platform and straightened and looked at him. Her eyes were brown and clear and held the particular steadiness that comes not from certainty but from having survived uncertainty so many times that it no longer has the power to knock you sideways. She spoke first. "I know what everyone is thinking." Garrett said nothing. He waited because he had learned that the most important thing a person said was usually not the first thing, that you were expecting someone prettier. Around them the platform had gone quiet in the specific way of a crowd that is pretending not to listen while listening to everything. Marin did not look away from him. "I won't blame you if you send me back. I know I'm not the woman from the photograph." She paused, and he could see that she was being precise, choosing words that said exactly what she meant and no more. "I know what I am and what I'm not, Mr. Weston. I'd rather hear the truth standing here than discover it later when leaving is harder." Garrett looked at her for a moment. He was not a man who spoke quickly, and the pause that followed was not uncomfortable to him, though he understood it might be to someone else. He was simply determining what was true. Then he reached down and picked up her suitcase. "I didn't pay for a picture," he said. His voice was low, the kind that did not require volume to carry. "I paid for a person." He looked at her once more, briefly, with the flat gray eyes that people in Redstone Creek described as giving nothing away. "And I've never judged a person by what strangers say about them." He turned and walked toward the wagon. Marin Hale stood very still for exactly 3 seconds. He did not see this because his back was to her, but he heard the sound of her picking up her second bag from where she had set it, and then the sound of her footsteps following him. Behind them, Lavinia Pruett and Margaret Osgood exchanged glances that contained everything from surprise to the particular dissatisfaction of spectators who had been promised a different kind of spectacle. Garrett helped her up onto the wagon without comment. He climbed up himself, took the reins, and drove out of Redstone Creek without looking back. Marin sat beside him, and he was aware, without looking directly at her, that she was holding herself together with considerable effort. Not from fear, not from cold, from the particular strain of having maintained composure under pressure for long enough that the body eventually sends a bill for it. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked at the road ahead. He drove in silence for nearly 10 minutes. The road out of Redstone Creek moved through open land, and the sky above it was the kind of Wyoming sky that made everything below it feel small in a way that was not diminishing but clarifying. Chicago had buildings that divided the horizon into manageable sections. Out here, the horizon simply continued, without interruption in every direction. "Were you waiting long?" she finally asked. "An hour," he said. "The train had trouble outside of Medicine Bow." She paused. "I'm sorry you had to wait. It was fine, not unkind. Final." The voice of a man who did not require apologies for things outside a person's control. A silence settled, the comfortable kind that neither of them rushed to fill. Then Marin said, "I need to tell you something." "All right, the photograph." She kept her eyes on the road. "I need you to understand about the photograph." He said nothing, which she appeared to take as permission to continue. "The agency required one. I didn't have a portrait. A neighbor offered to help." She straightened her spine slightly, the way a person straightens before saying something that cost them something. Her daughter had sat for a portrait 2 years earlier. She thought it would improve my chances. I told her it was dishonest. She told me everyone presents themselves favorably in these arrangements, that it was no different from wearing your best dress to a first meeting. A pause. I should have refused. I know that. I should have told you before you paid for my passage, and I did not, and that was wrong of me. She stopped. I don't have a reason that excuses it, she said. I only have the fact that I was desperate, and desperation causes people to do things they are not proud of. The wagon moved steadily along the road. Are you finished? Garrett asked. She blinked. Yes, I knew, he said. She turned to look at him. The agency has a reputation, he said simply. I wrote to a man in Denver who had used them. He told me the photographs were often approximate. A pause. I was more concerned with the letters. My letters? Yes. He glanced at her briefly. The things you chose to write about told me everything the photograph couldn't. Marin looked at the road ahead. The land went on in every direction, further than she had ever been able to see from any point in her life until today, and she sat with that for a long moment, and something in her expression that had been carefully maintained since the platform in Redstone Creek shifted, not dramatically, not visibly to a casual observer, but perceptibly, the way ice shifts in the moment before it gives. She did not cry. She was not a person who cried easily, and her life had made her less so. But she sat very still, and the stillness had a different quality than the stillness on the platform. The Weston Ranch came into view as the road crested a low hill, and Marin straightened to look at it. She had formed an image in her mind based on what the letters had suggested about the scale of the operation, about the 4,000 acres, the 60 head of cattle, the number of ranch hands Garrett employed. She had expected something large. What she saw was large, and something else. The main house was substantial, 2 stories, well-built, maintained on the outside with the careful attention of a man who understood that a structure deteriorated if you let it. But there was something about it that she absorbed before she had words for it. No garden, no flowers. The trees around the house were there because trees had always been there, not because anyone had planted them with intention. The curtains in the front windows were the color of things that had been in shadow for too long. It was a house that was doing its job of being a house without being anything more than that. It's large, she said. 3 bedrooms upstairs, Garrett said. The one at the end of the hall will be yours. There's a lock on the door. She looked at him. This is a practical arrangement, he said. I want you to be clear about what's expected and what's yours by right. What is expected? The house, he said. Meals. Help with the accounts. I understand you have some education in figures. He drove in silence for a moment. In exchange, you have your own room, appropriate wages, and the legal protections of marriage in the territory. Another pause. I don't expect anything that isn't agreed upon. I want that understood. Understood, she said. Good. He pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the house. Welcome to the Weston Ranch. He climbed down and carried her suitcase inside without ceremony. Marin stayed on the wagon for one more moment. She looked at the dark curtains. She looked at the absence of flowers, at the life that was being lived here in the most functional sense of the word and no further. Then she climbed down and followed him. The first week was a study in careful silence. Garrett Weston was not a cruel man. He was a self-contained one, which was a different thing entirely. He rose before dawn and was out of the house before Marin came downstairs. He returned from meals with the appetite of someone who ate because the body required it. He spoke when there was something to communicate. He listened when she spoke. He did not speak otherwise. Marin cooked. She cleaned. She explored the house the way she approached any new situation, methodically, without disturbing anything, simply trying to understand the shape of a place before she attempted to change anything about it. What she found over 3 days of quiet observation told her more than a week of conversation would have. The kitchen had everything required to produce food and nothing suggesting that food had ever been enjoyed there. The dishes were clean and practical and utterly without character. The parlor had furniture arranged with a kind of geometric precision, as though someone had once taken great care over the placement of each piece, and then the care had simply stopped, the way a clock stops when nobody winds it. On the mantelpiece in the parlor there was a single photograph in a silver frame. A woman, young, dark-haired, laughing at whoever stood behind the camera with the complete unguarded joy of someone caught in the middle of the best moment of a good day. Not posed, not arranged. Simply alive in the way that people are alive when they are not thinking about being observed. Marin looked at it for a long time. Then she went back to the kitchen. She did not ask about the photograph. She had not been told about it, and she understood instinctively that asking about it would be the kind of intrusion that could not be undone. She noted it the way she noted everything, filed it away, added it to the picture she was building in her mind about the shape of this man's life and what had happened to it. On the 3rd day, she found the garden. It was behind the house, separated from the backyard by a low stone wall that had been built with care and was now doing its job of holding itself together without any attention from anyone. The garden itself was immediately visible as something that had once been significant. The structure was still there beneath the neglect, raised beds in a deliberate arrangement, a stone path between them worn smooth by years of use, and in the far southeast corner, a section that had clearly been given over to flowers rather than vegetables. Someone had put real thought into this garden. Someone had loved working in it. Maren stood at the wall and looked at it for a long time. She thought about soil temperature and what it would take to turn ground that had been left alone for years. She thought about root systems, about how much life could persist underground in things that appeared on the surface to be finished. Then she went to find Garrett. He was in the barn with a young horse that was clearly unhappy about whatever it was being asked to do. Maren stood at the entrance and watched him work with the animal for a moment before she said anything. The patience of it struck her. The quiet, steady way he spoke to the horse, never raising his voice, never forcing anything, simply waiting out the fear until the animal had no more fear to give and settled into something calmer. She noted that too, Mr. Weston. He glanced at her without stopping. Something wrong? No. I wanted to ask about the garden. A pause so small she almost missed it. What about it? I'd like to put it back, she said, if that would be acceptable. Garrett was quiet. The young horse shifted, and he put his hand on its neck, and it stilled. It's overgrown, he said. Yes, a lot of work. I know. He was quiet again. The barn held the warm smell of hay and horses and the accumulated work of many years. Then he said, do what you want with it. It's your household to manage. He went back to the horse. Maren went back to the house and began making a list of what she would need. By the end of the second week, Maren had learned several things about Redstone Creek that Garrett had not told her. She learned them from Harriet Fenwick, who arrived at the ranch on a Tuesday morning with an apple pie and the kind of warm, direct energy that Maren recognized as belonging to a woman who was both genuinely kind and genuinely curious, and who made no particular effort to conceal either quality. Harriet was perhaps 45, red hair going gray, with an expressive face that moved through its reactions openly and without editing. She liked Maren immediately and said so, which Maren found both refreshing and slightly alarming. They sat at the kitchen table with coffee, and Harriet said, I have to tell you what Garrett did at the station. Picking up your bag. What he said. She shook her head slowly. That man has not done anything that surprised anyone in Redstone Creek in 4 years. What happened 4 years ago? Maren asked. Harriet paused. Then, with the care of someone choosing words around something fragile, she said he lost his wife, Iris. She stopped. Everyone loved Iris. A fever took her in January of '77. It was very fast. She looked at Maren directly, and Garrett just closed. Like a door. People tried for a while. You know how people try. And then they stopped trying because he made it clear he didn't want it. Maren was quiet. He hasn't had anyone in this house since the funeral, Harriet said. Not for dinner. Not for help. Nothing. She looked at her coffee. I'm not telling you this to warn you or to upset you. I'm telling you because you should understand what you're working with. You're in a house with a man who is still grieving, whether he'd ever say so or not. Grief makes people complicated. I know something about grief, Maren said quietly. Harriet looked at her. My father, Maren said. 3 years before he died, I cared for him. I know what it does to a person, how it becomes the shape of everything else. Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You are not what I expected. Maren looked up. I'm not saying it the way the people at the station said things, Harriet said immediately. I'm saying it as a fact. Lavinia Pruitt has been telling everyone who will listen that Garrett got a bad arrangement, that you're not what he expected. She made a short, dismissive sound. Lavinia Pruitt has been waiting for Garrett to be available again since Iris died. She is furious that he sent to Chicago for someone instead of noticing her suggestion about her cousin. She looked at Maren firmly. Don't let anything she says touch you. It doesn't, Maren said. Harriet watched her with the particular attention of someone who noticed the difference between what people said and what was true. Yes, it does, she said gently. I can see that it does, and there's no shame in that. Words that have followed you your whole life carry weight, even when you're tired of carrying them. Maren looked at her hands around the coffee cup. Something in her composure, the composure she had been maintaining since Chicago, since the platform, since the wagon ride, and the dark curtains and the silver frame on the mantelpiece, shifted slightly. I heard them, she said, at the station, every word. I know, Harriet said. I'm sorry. People here forget that other people can hear them. They don't forget, Maren said. They just don't care. Harriet absorbed this. Then she reached across the table and briefly covered Maren's hand with her own. Some of us care, she said. The following week, Clem told Maren about the roses. Clem was 19 years old and looked younger, with the wiry, settled competence of someone who had been working ranch land since he was old enough to be useful. He did not speak much, but when he did, he said things that mattered, which was a quality Maren had come to recognize and value in the people worth knowing. He found her at the stone wall of the garden, examining the dead canes in the southeast corner. He stood beside her for a moment without saying anything in the way of someone who has something to say and is finding the right approach to it. She planted those, he said finally. Mrs. Weston, the first one. He said it with the quiet care of someone handling something that might break. She said red roses were the only thing worth fighting the Wyoming wind for. Maren looked at the dead canes. The root systems were still there. She could see that from the way the crown sat at the soil line. Dormant, neglected, but not dead, not completely. Do you know what variety? She asked. Clem blinked. I might be able to find out. There was a nursery in Laramie she ordered from. I'd like to bring them back, Marin said, if it's possible. She looked at the canes for another moment. Would that be all right, do you think? Clem was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, there was a roughness in his voice that had nothing to do with his age. Mr. Weston told every person who asked about this garden to leave it alone, he said. Mrs. Fenwick asked. The ladies from the church asked. He told all of them no. He paused. He didn't tell you no. Marin looked at him. With Mr. Weston, Clem said carefully. Not saying no is about as close to a yes as he gets about certain things. He went back to his work. Marin knelt beside the rose canes and looked at them carefully for a long time. She understood something about things that looked finished and were not. She had understood it her whole life, from the first time she had watched her father seem to disappear into his illness and then surface again, briefly, to be himself. She understood it from the years she had spent being the woman that nobody looked at twice, and from the particular discipline that required. Things that looked dead were sometimes only waiting. She understood that better than most people might have expected. Order them, she said quietly to Clem's retreating back. Please. Clem nodded once without turning around. He went back to his work, and she noticed that he walked a little differently afterward, with the ease of someone who has done the right thing and knows it. The confrontation with Lavinia Pruitt came on a Friday afternoon, 3 weeks after Marin's arrival. She was at Garfield's Mercantile filling the household order when she felt the shift in the room that meant something was about to happen. Lavinia came in with Margaret Osgood and Ruth Delacroix, and the three of them arranged themselves in the space with the practiced ease of women who had been navigating social situations together for years. Mrs. Weston. Lavinia's voice had the bright, pleasant surface of a woman who would describe her own cruelty as simple honesty. I didn't see you there, Mrs. Pruitt, Marin said, and turned back to the order list she was going through with Mr. Garfield. Lavinia was not accustomed to being continued past. I imagine it's quite a change, she said, stepping closer. From the city. Somewhat, Marin said. She wrote something in the household ledger she had started keeping. I imagine Garrett is glad to have someone managing the house. Lavinia's voice had the particular register of a woman using pleasantness as a weapon. He's been so alone out there since Iris. Marin wrote another line in the ledger. I heard you had some schooling, Lavinia continued. Is that right? Some, Marin said. How useful. She made it sound like the opposite, though I suppose Garrett needed more practical help than intellectual conversation. Men like Garrett generally know what's actually useful to them. Marin closed the ledger. She turned to face Lavinia, and she did it slowly, the way a person turns when they are making a deliberate choice rather than a reactive one. Mrs. Pruitt, she said, I've found that people who make sustained observations about other people's marriages usually do so because they find the subject more interesting than is quite appropriate. The store went quiet. I won't presume to know what Garrett needs, Marin said, her voice perfectly even. But I'm quite certain his needs are not your concern, given that you are not his wife. Lavinia's pleasant surface went rigid. I was only being neighborly, she said. I know exactly what you were being, Marin said. She picked up her ledger and looked at Mr. Garfield. I'll come back for the order Thursday if that works. Thursday's fine, Mrs. Weston, Garfield said, looking at his counter with the careful neutrality of a man who wanted no part of what had just occurred. Marin walked out of the store and stood on the boardwalk for exactly 30 seconds, breathing the cold October air, feeling her heart move against her ribs. Then she walked to the wagon and drove back to the ranch. She did not tell Garrett, but something had settled in her, the internal kind of line that other people couldn't see but that mattered more than the visible kind. She had decided something, and the deciding of it had a weight that was also a relief. That evening, Garrett came in late from the far pasture. Marin had kept supper warm. He came to the table in the way he always came, quiet, the day's work still visible in the set of his shoulders, and she put food in front of him and sat across the table with her own plate. They had begun eating together without discussing it. The first several nights, Marin had left food for him and eaten earlier. Then one evening he had come in while she was still at the table, and he had simply sat down and eaten without comment. After that, it had been what they did. I went to town today, she said. I know. Garfield sent word. He continued eating, said there had been some talk. Mrs. Pruitt was there. Garrett said nothing. She said some things. Marin kept her voice level. I responded to them. Now he looked at her. What did you say? I told her that your needs were not her concern and that I knew exactly what she was being. There was a silence. Then Garrett said something Marin had not heard from him before. 2 words only, but the way he said them, with a kind of flat, complete satisfaction, told her everything she needed to know about where he stood. Good, he said. He picked up his fork and went back to eating. Marin looked at her plate. The knocking in her chest had quieted. What remained was something smaller and more durable, the specific knowledge that she was not entirely alone in this house, in this town, in this new life she was making from the only materials she had. It was not a large thing, but she had learned long ago that the things that held you up were rarely the large things. It was Harriet Fenwick who came back on a Thursday afternoon with the look of someone carrying information that had become too heavy to carry alone. I want to warn you about something, Harriet said, sitting at the kitchen table where she had become a regular presence. And I want to be careful how I say it, because I don't want to alarm you more than is useful. Marin poured the coffee and sat down. Aldous Crane has been asking questions, Harriet said. Marin was quiet. About what? Harriet wrapped her hands around the cup. About Garrett, about the ranch, about the water rights to Cedar Spring, she paused, and about you, about the marriage. What kind of questions? Whether the marriage seems genuine, Harriet said, and she said it with the care of someone delivering something they know will land badly. Whether people think it's a real arrangement or a convenient one. The kitchen was very quiet. Who is Aldous Crane? Marin asked. Harriet looked at her steadily. The wealthiest man in this valley, she said. He owns the Redstone Territorial Bank, 3 hotels, and approximately half the judges between here and Cheyenne. He has been acquiring land in this valley for 6 years. He owns everything east of Cedar Creek. She paused. Garrett's land is west of it. Garrett's ranch has the water rights to Cedar Spring. Without those rights, the ranches on the eastern side of the valley are limited in what they can sustain through a dry summer. He's tried to buy Garrett out, Marin said. It was not a question. Twice, Harriet said. Garrett refused both times. The second refusal was not a pleasant exchange. Marin was quiet for a moment, turning it over, finding the shape of it. He's not asking about the marriage because he's curious, she said. No, Harriet said. He is not. He's looking for a pressure point. Harriet looked at her with the expression of a woman who had hoped not to have to say that out loud. Yes, Marin thought about what Harriet had said, about the questions Crane was asking, about the specific nature of his interest in whether the marriage was genuine. She thought about Lavinia Pruitt at the station and at the Mercantile. She thought about the 30 people on the platform who had already made their decision about what she was before she had said a single word. What does he look like? She asked. Harriet blinked. Why? Because I want to know him when I see him. Harriet studied her for a long moment. Then slowly she described him. Silver-haired, around 52, impeccably dressed regardless of the occasion. A way of smiling that was technically a smile. A way of speaking that sounded like a compliment until you listened carefully and understood it was not. Marin nodded. She stored it alongside everything else she was building. He'll try to use you, Harriet said quietly. I think he's already working out how. I know, Marin said. Intent and outcome aren't always the same, Harriet said. Just be careful, Marin. Aldous Crane has undone people who were far more prepared for him than you are. Marin looked at her coffee. Then she said, quietly, with a certainty that came from somewhere deep and long established, the kind of certainty that comes not from confidence, but from having nothing left to lose. He has never dealt with someone who has already lost everything once and is still here. Harriet looked at her for a long moment. Tell me, she said, what happened in Chicago before you came here? And Marin told her. She told her about her father and the 3 years of watching him go. She told her about the debts and the landlady and the Tuesday afternoon at the Chesterfield agency. She told it plainly, without ornamentation, the way she did most things. Harriet listened without interrupting. When Marin finished, Harriet was quiet for a moment. Then she said, build something solid here before Crane makes his move. Because I've seen what he does to people who aren't ready for him, and you deserve better than that story. She put on her coat and walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the frame. I'm glad you're here, Marin. I want you to know that. She left. Marin sat at the kitchen table for a long time after the sound of Harriet's wagon faded into the distance. She looked at her hands. She looked at the household ledger open on the table. She looked at the frost beginning to form on the window glass and the enormous Wyoming sky beyond it, going on in every direction further than she could follow. Then she stood up and went to find Garrett. He was in the barn. Mr. Weston, she said from the doorway. I need to talk to you about something. He looked up. Harriet Fenwick came by today, she said. She told me about Aldous Crane. Something moved across Garrett's face that was not quite an expression, something below the surface of expression. What did she tell you? Enough, Marin said. She told me enough. Garrett set down what he was working with. He looked at her for a moment with the full, direct attention he rarely gave to anything that wasn't the land or the animals in his care. What do you want to say? Marin stepped inside the barn. The warmth of it registered after the cold of the yard, hay and horses, and the smell of years of careful work. I want to say, she said carefully, that I didn't come here expecting to be in the middle of a land dispute. No, he said, you didn't. And I want to say that if you would prefer I stay out of it, whatever it turns out to be, I would understand that. Garrett looked at her. Is that what you want? She met his gaze without looking away. No, she said, it isn't. A pause. I spent 3 years watching someone I loved become unable to protect himself while people around us made decisions he no longer had the strength to fight, she said. I don't do well with watching from the side. Garrett said nothing for a moment. I understand accounts, Marin said. I understand documents. I'm not afraid of legal language or legal proceedings. She paused. I know I've only been here 3 weeks. I know I'm still a stranger in most of the ways that matter. But I am your wife in the eyes of this territory, and what happens to this ranch happens to me. She held his gaze. Let me help. The barn was quiet around them. Garrett Weston, who had built walls around himself for 4 years, who had learned to move through his own life without fully inhabiting it, who had looked at a platform full of people and felt nothing until he looked at a woman who refused to lower her eyes, looked at Marin Hale. And he said 2 words. All right. Marin had spent enough time around people who rationed their trust like water in a drought to understand that what Garrett Weston had just given her was not a small thing. She walked back to the house in the cold October air and stood in the kitchen with her hands pressed flat on the table and thought about what she had just committed herself to. 3 weeks in Wyoming territory, 1 suitcase, a borrowed photograph she had already confessed to, 7 months of practice pretending she was not afraid, and now she had told a man she barely knew that she wanted to help him fight the most powerful man in the valley. She opened the household ledger and turned to a fresh page and began writing. Not about the house, about Aldous Crane, about Cedar Spring, about what she knew and what she needed to know and what the distance between those two things would cost them if they couldn't close it in time. She wrote quickly in the small, precise handwriting her schoolteacher had called efficient, and her father had called the handwriting of someone who understood that paper remembered things people forgot. She did not stop until she heard Garrett come in from the barn an hour later. He stopped in the kitchen doorway and looked at what she was doing. "What is that?" "Everything Harriet told me," Marin said, "organized by what I can verify and what I can't." She turned the ledger so he could see the columns she had made, the questions listed with space beside each one for answers. "I want to understand the water rights first, the legal documentation. Do you have the original deed?" Garrett looked at the ledger for a moment. Something shifted in his expression, a very slight recalibration of the way he was seeing the situation. Then he said, "I'll get the deed box." He came back with a battered wooden box that had clearly not been opened recently. He set it on the table and Marin opened it without ceremony and began to read. Garrett sat across from her. He watched her read the way a person watches something they had not accounted for, not with any particular expression, but with the specific attention of someone whose understanding of a situation is being quietly revised. Marin read everything in the box twice. She asked questions. Garrett answered them, sometimes briefly, sometimes with more detail than she had expected, and occasionally with a directness that told her he had been carrying these worries alone for long enough that having someone to say them to was its own kind of relief, even if he would not have framed it that way. They were at the table until past 10. When Marin finally closed the ledger, she said, "The water rights documentation is solid. The original grant is clear." She paused. "What I don't understand yet is why Crane thinks he can challenge it. Has he given any indication of the angle he plans to use?" Garrett was quiet for a moment. "He's been suggesting the original survey was inaccurate." Marin looked up. "Inaccurate how?" "Claiming the boundary markers for Cedar Spring were placed incorrectly. That the water rights I've held for 8 years are based on a filing that doesn't match what was actually granted. That's a document challenge," Marin said. "He'd need a surveyor willing to provide false testimony, and he'd need the original survey records to have some discrepancy he could exploit." She thought for a moment. "Where are the original survey records held?" "Territorial Land Office in Cheyenne. And who controls access to them?" Garrett looked at her with the first real edge of something she had not seen in him before. Not alarm exactly. The expression of a man who has just been asked a question that points somewhere he had not thought to look. "What are you suggesting?" "I'm suggesting," Marin said carefully, "that if Aldous Crane has relationships with half the judges between here and Cheyenne, he may also have someone at the land office." She paused. "Has anyone verified that the records in Cheyenne match what's in this box?" The silence that followed was its own answer. Garrett said very quietly, "No." Marin nodded. "That's the first thing we need to do." Garrett moved to the window. He stood with his back to her and she could see the set of his shoulders, the tension of a man who has just understood that a fight he believed was still coming has already begun. "Write to your lawyer tonight," Marin said. "Ask him to go to the land office personally and look at the survey records for Cedar Spring. Don't explain why in the letter, just ask him to look." Garrett turned from the window. "Why not explain why?" "Because if Crane has someone at the land office," Marin said, "he may also have someone reading correspondence." She met his gaze. "Trust is expensive right now. Spend it carefully." Garrett stared at her. He had the expression of a man encountering something he had not accounted for in his calculations about what this arrangement was going to be. "Where did you learn to think like that?" he asked. Marin looked at the ledger on the table. 3 years of watching people take advantage of someone who couldn't protect himself, she said. "You learn to see it coming." Garrett was quiet. Then he sat back down, pulled a piece of paper toward him and began to write. Marin got up and put the kettle on. Some things required coffee, and this was going to be a long night. The letter went out the next morning with the first rider into town. Then they waited. Waiting was its own kind of discipline. Marin had learned this while caring for her father, the particular skill of continuing to function as though the ground were solid when you understood perfectly well that it might not be. She channeled it the way she had always channeled things that needed to be held at a distance, into her hands, into work. The garden became the primary recipient. She had begun clearing it the week before, pulling weeds, turning the cold soil, assessing what was salvageable and what had gone too far. Now she worked at it with the focused energy of someone who needed something tangible to move toward. The ground was hard in the mornings and the wind came off the mountains without apology, but she found a rhythm in it, and rhythm was a kind of anchor when everything else was uncertain. Clem came around on the second day and stood watching her for a while without speaking. He had a way of being present without imposing on a silence, which Marin had come to appreciate. "That garden's been dead going on 4 years," he said eventually. "I know," she said. "People tried early on," he said. "Mrs. Fenwick and some of the church women. They wanted to keep it up. Mr. Weston told them to leave it. Marin kept working. What do you think he'll say about this?" she asked. Clem considered it with the seriousness he brought to most questions. "I think," he said carefully, "that this time he's not saying anything. And for Mr. Weston, not saying anything about this particular garden is about as close to permission as a thing can get." Something settled quietly in Marin's chest. The reply from Silas Drummond came on a Monday, 11 days after they had sent the letter. Garrett brought it in from the morning delivery and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it and then looked at Marin, and neither of them moved for a moment that was longer than it needed to be. Then she picked it up and opened it. She read it twice. Then she set it down and pressed both hands flat on the table and breathed very carefully for a count of 5. Garrett watched her. "What does it say?" Marin looked up at him. "He went to the land office," she said. "He asked to see the survey records for your property." She paused. "The record for Cedar Spring is missing." Garrett went completely still. "Not damaged," Marin said. "Not misfiled. Missing." She held his gaze. "The index shows it should be there. The physical file is gone." The kitchen was absolutely silent. Then Garrett said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "He got to the records." "Drummond says the clerk on duty told him the file had been requested for review 3 weeks ago," Marin said, "by a surveying company." She looked at the letter. "The name of the company is Consolidated Western Survey." "I've never heard of it," Garrett said. "Drummond has." Marin set the letter down. "He writes that he knows the company, that it has been involved in 2 other land disputes in the territory in the last year." She paused. "Both times the original survey records were challenged. Both times the ranchers lost their land." Garrett moved to the window. His back was to her, and she could see that his hands were at his sides and he was holding them deliberately open, because what they wanted to do was close. "He's been planning this," Garrett said. "Not since I turned him down the second time. Before that. He had this in motion before I had any reason to be on guard." "Yes," Marin said, "I think so." "He was waiting until I had something to lose," Garrett said. The words were very flat. Marin looked at his back, at the set of his shoulders, at what was happening inside him that he was not going to let show on the outside, because that was what this man did, absorbed things into himself and kept moving. "Garrett," she said. He turned. She had used his given name only once before, in the barn when she had asked to help. The moment registered in both of them, brief and distinct. "This is not over," she said. "Missing records are not destroyed records. Drummond can petition the land office for a full accounting. There are federal statutes that govern exactly this kind of situation." She paused. "I've been reading about territorial land disputes." Garrett stared at her. "You've been reading federal land statutes?" "Since our conversation in the barn," she said. "Bertram Fenwick brought me what he had. 3 volumes. They were useful." Garrett said nothing for a moment. The barn conversation had been 11 days ago. "There's something else," Marin then said. "Drummond mentions in the letter that Consolidated Western Survey was incorporated 18 months ago." She looked at him steadily. "Its principal shareholder is a holding company called Crane Valley Holdings." The room absorbed that. Garrett said very carefully, "He owns the company that took my records." "Yes," Marin said. "Which means he didn't plan to challenge the survey. He planned to manufacture the challenge." She held his gaze. "That is not a land dispute. That is fraud." The word landed in the kitchen with the weight of a word that changes what comes after it. Garrett looked at her for a long moment. "If we can prove that, we have to be careful," Marin said. "Right now we have a letter from a lawyer who noticed something. We don't have proof of intent. We don't have the records themselves. We have the absence of records and a name on a corporate filing." She paused. "That's enough to start. It is not enough to win. What do we need?" Marin opened the ledger to the page she had been building for 12 days. "The original survey notes," she said, "not the filed record. Surveyors keep field notes separately from what they submit to the land office. If we can find the original surveyor—" "He's dead," Garrett said. "Thomas Pratt, he died 2 years ago." Marin stopped, thought. Did he have a family? Something shifted in Garrett's expression. The look of a man who has just been given a direction he had not thought to look. "A son," he said. "Ezra Pratt. He took over his father's surveying practice." He paused. "He's in Laramie. The field notes would have passed to him with the business," Marin said. "If Thomas Pratt kept thorough well records." "Meticulous," Garrett said. "Everyone who worked with him said so." Marin looked at him. "Then we need to get to Laramie before Crane thinks of it too." It was Clem who told them they were already being watched. He came to the house that evening while Marin was cooking and Garrett was at the table writing another letter to Drummond, and he came with the careful manner of someone delivering information he understands is important. "Mr. Weston," he said from the doorway, "there's been a man at the end of the South Road. Yesterday and today. He's not traveling through. Travelers move. This one's just there." Garrett set down his pen. "What does he look like?" "Young," Clem said. "City clothes, mostly. Good horse." He had a notebook. The 3 of them absorbed that. "Crane's man," Garrett said. "Maybe," Clem said. "Maybe someone passing through who likes to linger. But I thought you should know." "You were right to tell me," Garrett said. Thank you, Clem. Clem nodded and left. Marin turned from the stove. He knows we're moving. Or suspects, Garrett said. Or he's covering his positions regardless. He looked at her. Either way, we can't take the Laramie trip quietly. If there's a man watching the road, he'll see us go. Let him see us go, Marin said. Garrett looked at her. Let him know we're going to Laramie, she said. He doesn't know why. He doesn't know about Ezra Pratt. He doesn't know what we're looking for. She paused. If Crane thinks we're rattled and running, he might move too fast. People who move too fast make mistakes they can't unmake. Garrett considered this. You want him to think we don't know what we're doing. I want him to think we're frightened and grasping, Marin said. There's a difference. Garrett was quiet for a moment, looking at her with the flat gray eyes that people in Redstone Creek said gave nothing away, and that Marin had come to understand gave quite a lot away if you knew what you were looking at. All right, he said. We go to Laramie this week, openly. I'll say I'm looking at stock. You'll come because it's your first time in Laramie and you want to see it. He paused. We behave exactly like a couple on a routine trip. And while we're there, Marin said, we find Ezra Pratt. They left on a Tuesday morning. Garrett told Clem to mention in town that he was going to look at stock. Marin mentioned it to the woman at the post office when she stopped to send a letter. By the time they passed the end of the South Road, the man with the notebook was gone. Someone had already carried the information where it needed to go, and there was nothing more to observe. That was fine. That was exactly what they needed Crane to believe. The ride to Laramie took most of the day. Marin sat beside Garrett on the wagon with the legal volumes open in her lap, cross-referencing the federal statutes on territorial land rights with the notes she had been accumulating for 2 weeks. Garrett drove and occasionally asked questions. She answered them. The conversation moved between the legal and the practical with the ease of two people who had found, without announcing it, a common language. At midday, they stopped by the road to eat. Garrett had packed provisions with the efficiency of a man who did not consider meals an occasion but understood that they were necessary. They sat on the wagon and ate and did not talk very much, and it was only afterward, back on the road with Laramie still an hour ahead, that Marin recognized the quality of the silence between them. Not the careful silence of the first week. Something easier. Something that did not need to be managed. She held that recognition quietly and did not speak it aloud. Laramie was larger than Redstone Creek and moved with the energy of a town that considered itself on the way to somewhere more significant. They arrived in the late afternoon and found the lodgings Drummond had arranged. 2 rooms at a decent hotel on the main street. Marin noticed the 2 rooms without comment. They agreed to meet in the morning. Marin did not sleep particularly well. She lay in the dark and ran through everything she knew about Ezra Pratt, which amounted to almost nothing, and everything she needed from him, which amounted to quite a lot. She thought about approach and angle and what she could offer a man she had never met that he would actually want. She was still thinking about it when the light changed outside and she got up and dressed. Ezra Pratt's office was on a side street 2 blocks off the main road, the kind of location that said a man did solid work for people who knew where to find him and did not need to advertise for the rest. The sign outside was neat and professionally lettered. Marin approved of that before they went in. Ezra himself was perhaps 30, with the kind of face that seemed permanently set against a strong light, a surveyor's habit from years of sighting lines across open ground. He had his father's build, Garrett said quietly as they approached, broad through the shoulders, careful in his movements. He was not expecting them. He looked at Garrett with the cautious recognition of a man who knows someone by reputation rather than by regular acquaintance, and at Marin with the neutral curiosity of a man assessing a situation before committing to a response. Garrett Weston, he said. It's been a few years. Ezra, Garrett said. This is my wife, Marin. Ezra shook her hand with the matter-of-fact courtesy of someone who treated all people as professional equals until given reason to do otherwise. What can I do for you? Garrett looked at Marin. This they had agreed on during the ride. The opening was hers to make. Mr. Pratt, Marin said, I want to be direct with you because I believe directness will serve us both better than anything else. She paused. You know who Aldous Crane is? Something shifted in Ezra's expression. Fractionally, but she caught it. I know of him, he said carefully. Your father surveyed the Weston property in 1873, Marin said, including the Cedar Spring water rights. The filed record of that survey has gone missing from the Cheyenne Land Office. The company that requested it is owned by Aldous Crane. She held his gaze. We believe your father kept field notes separately from the filed record. We believe those notes would confirm the original survey and make it extremely difficult for anyone to successfully challenge the water rights documentation. The office was quiet. Outside, Laramie moved along its ordinary business, wagons and voices, and the sound of a town that did not know or care what was happening in this particular room. Ezra looked at Garrett, then back at Marin. Something was working behind his eyes, the calculation of a man, determining how much trouble he was prepared to step into and what it would cost him either way. If I had such notes, he said, and if I produced them, what would you be asking me to do with them? Testify, Marin said, before the Federal Land Commission, that the notes are your father's, that they are accurate, that the Cedar Spring boundary markers were placed correctly in 1873 and are correctly recorded in the filed deed. Ezra was quiet for a long moment. Mr. Crane is a powerful man, he said. Yes, Marin said. He is. He has long relationships with a great many people in this territory. Yes. You're asking me to stand in front of a federal commission and contradict whatever surveyor he is paid to say otherwise. Yes, Marin said. That is exactly what I am asking. Ezra looked at her with the expression of a man who had expected to be maneuvered and had instead been handed the plain, unvarnished truth and was not entirely sure what to do with it. Mrs. Weston, he said slowly, do you understand what it could cost me if Crane decided to make it cost something? I do, Marin said. I'm not asking you to do it without that understanding. I'm asking you to do it because it is true, and because the alternative is watching a man defraud ranchers out of land they legally own, and because your father spent his career placing accurate markers and writing accurate records, and that work deserves to stand. She paused. But I won't pretend there is no risk. That would be dishonest, and I don't do dishonest well. Ezra Pratt stared at her. Then he turned, crossed to a cabinet in the corner of the office, and opened the lower drawer. He came back carrying a bound leather notebook, old and well-maintained, and set it on the desk between them. My father's field notes, he said. 1873 survey, Weston property, Cedar Spring boundaries. He looked at Garrett. He was the most careful man I ever knew. Everything in here is accurate and dated and witnessed. Garrett reached for the notebook. His hand was very steady. I'll need time, Ezra said, to prepare properly, to go through the notes and be certain I can speak to everything in them. How much time? Marin asked. 2 weeks, maybe 3. We may not have 3 weeks, she said. If Crane already has someone at the land office preparing a fraudulent replacement survey, once he files it, the challenge becomes significantly more difficult. We need to bring this to the federal commission before he does. Ezra absorbed this. He looked at Garrett. Is Silas Drummond handling this? Yes, Garrett said. Drummond is straight, Ezra said. He held the notebook for a moment longer, looking at it with the expression of a man holding something that belongs to someone who is no longer there to hold it themselves. 2 weeks. I can be ready in 2 weeks. I'll prepare a full affidavit and compile the relevant pages. He paused. Not for money, he said. My father knew your father, Garrett. They worked that Cedar Spring survey together in the field. He would want this to stand. Garrett looked at him for a moment. When he spoke, his voice came out rougher than he had likely intended. Thank you, Ezra. Ezra nodded once, the brief nod of a man who has made a decision and is done deliberating about it. Don't let Crane know you have this, he said. Not yet. Let him think his plan is working. We intend to, Marin said. They were back in Redstone Creek by Thursday. Friday morning, Marin was in the kitchen when Garrett came in from the yard with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger. Something colder and more deliberate than anger. The expression of a man receiving news he had prepared himself for and still finds worse than anticipated. He set a document on the table without speaking. Marin read it. Aldous Crane had filed a motion with the territorial court, challenging the Western water rights to Cedar Spring on the grounds of alleged survey inaccuracies in the 1873 filing. She read it twice. Then she set it down and looked at the language carefully, the specific legal arguments being made, the structure of the challenge, what it was claiming and what it was leaving room to claim later. He moved faster than I thought, she said. He filed Monday, Garrett said. Drummond received notice this morning. He hasn't filed a replacement survey yet, Marin said. He's only filed the challenge. That means he either doesn't have one prepared or he's waiting to see how we respond before he commits to a specific counterclaim, she thought. Write to Drummond today. Tell him to file for a continuance. We need 30 days to prepare our response, and we're entitled to that under territorial procedure. She paused. Also tell him to notify the Federal Land Commission about the missing record. Not as a formal complaint yet. Just a notification. We want the commission to know the record went missing before Crane files anything further. You think the territorial court is compromised, Garrett said. I think the judge assigned to this motion has had a business relationship with Aldous Crane for 6 years, Marin said. Drummond mentioned it in his second letter. That's why I suggested the federal commission in the barn. Crane built this to go through territorial court because he picked his judge in advance. She met his gaze. He didn't account for us taking it federal. Garrett sat down. He looked at her hands on the document, then at her face. To take it federal, we need evidence of systematic fraud, not just one missing record. I know, Marin said. That's the next step. He was quiet for a long moment. The kitchen held the ordinary morning sounds of the ranch outside, and between them on the table was the document that meant the fight they had been preparing for had officially arrived. This is my father's land, Garrett said very quietly. He built this ranch from open ground. He filed those water rights himself. He stood in a field with Thomas Pratt and watched him set those markers. He stopped. There was something in the way he said it, not grief exactly, but something adjacent to grief. The weight of a legacy that has been protected for a long time and is now under threat from a direction that was never anticipated. Marin sat down across from him. She did not say it was going to be fine, because she did not know if it was. She did not say they would win, because she did not know that either. What she knew was something smaller and more reliable than either of those things. Your father did everything right, she said. Everything legal. Everything documented, everything honest. Crane can challenge that. He can steal records and file motions and hire surveyors to provide false testimony, but he cannot change what actually happened in 1873. She held his gaze. Ezra Pratt has the field notes. Your father's legal file is in the deed box. Drummond is a straight lawyer, and the Federal Commission does not answer to territorial judges. Garrett looked at her. What if it's not enough? Then we find what else we need, Marin said, and we make it enough. She said it the way she had said things her whole life, not with the careless optimism of someone who did not understand the stakes, but the flat, settled steadiness of someone who understood them completely and had decided that did not change what needed to be done. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached across the table and covered her hands with his. He did not say anything. He did not need to. It was the gesture of a man who had not reached for another person in 4 years, doing it now, deliberately, without apology, because some things were more important than the walls you had built around yourself. Marin looked at his hand over hers, the size of it, the roughness from years of work, the simple, deliberate warmth of it. She did not move. She let it be what it was. After a moment, he took his hand back and stood. I'll write to Drummond. Yes, she said, do that. She stayed at the table after he left the room, and she told herself she was thinking about legal strategy, and partly she was. It was Bertram Fenwick who brought them the name. He came to the ranch on a Wednesday afternoon with Harriet, which was unusual. Bertram Fenwick was a quiet man who let his wife navigate the social geography of their lives, and came in person only when the information was too important to trust to second-hand delivery. He sat at the kitchen table with the deliberate manner of someone who had been thinking carefully about what he was about to say. I have a cousin in Cheyenne, he said. Works at the assessor's office near the land building. He told me something yesterday. He paused. There's a man named Fletcher Moss. He's a clerk at the Territorial Land Office. Been there 8 years. 3 months ago, he bought a house. The table was quiet. Fletcher Moss earns $40 a month, Bertram said. The house cost $900. Marin's pen stopped moving. 3 months ago, she said. About 6 weeks before the survey record went missing, Bertram said. Garrett looked at Marin. Marin looked at her ledger. There's more, Bertram said. Everyone looked at him. My cousin says Moss applied for a transfer to the Denver Land Office last month. Transfer was approved. He leaves in 10 days. 10 days. Marin set her pen down very carefully. If he leaves the territory, she said, he's outside the reach of a territorial subpoena. Yes, Bertram said, but federal employees are within federal jurisdiction regardless of location, Marin said, already turning to a clean page. It's significantly cleaner to reach him before he moves, though. Before he's established in a new position, before Crane has had time to prepare him for questions. She looked up. Drummond needs to file for an emergency federal subpoena today, this afternoon if possible. She was already writing. The grounds need to be specific, she said, writing quickly in the small, efficient hand that wasted nothing. Potential witness to the removal of federally indexed survey documentation, credible evidence of financial inducement corroborating the timeline of the record's disappearance. She looked at Garrett. If Drummond gets the right language in front of the right commissioner today, we can have the subpoena issued by Thursday. She handed Garrett the page. He read it quickly, looked at her. How do you know the right language? I've been reading Drummond's filings, she said, all the ones he sent us. I paid attention to how he structures a legal argument. Garrett folded the paper and put it in his coat. Bertram Fenwick watched this exchange with the quiet expression of a man who had come in with a specific expectation of how the conversation would go and was revising that expectation in real time. Garrett left for the telegraph office within the hour. Harriet stayed. She sat across from Marin at the kitchen table, and after the sound of the horse faded down the south road, she said, You knew what to do before he finished talking. I've been thinking about what Crane's weak points are, Marin said. A man who paid someone inside a government office left a trail. He couldn't avoid it. The question was always whether we could find the trail before it went cold. And now we have a name and a timeline in 10 days, Marin said. She looked at the ledger. It's enough. Harriet looked at her with the directness she had had from the very beginning. Marin, she said, I want to say something plainly. Marin looked up. You came here thinking you needed this arrangement to survive, Harriet said. And maybe that was true. But Garrett needs this too, even though he will never say so in those words. She paused. And this valley needs someone like you, even though it doesn't know that yet. Marin said nothing. Build something solid, Harriet said. With him, with this place. Before Crane gets what he's really after. She left soon after. Marin sat at the table alone and looked at Fletcher Moss's name written in her ledger, and at the timeline she had drawn out beside it, and at all the things she now knew that she had not known 3 weeks ago when she stepped off a train in Redstone Creek with one suitcase and a borrowed photograph and the desperate hope of a woman who had run out of every other option. She thought about root systems, about things that looked finished and were not. About what could still come back if you gave it room and time and the right conditions. Then she heard Garrett's horse come back down the south road at the pace of a man who had done what needed doing and was coming back to where the work continued. She opened the ledger to a fresh page and began writing the next thing that needed to be written. Aldous Crane's letter arrived on a Saturday afternoon. It was addressed to Garrett, delivered by a young man from the Silver Pine Hotel who said he had been told to wait for a response. Marin watched Garrett read it from across the kitchen. She watched his jaw set, which was the expression he used when something landed as expected and badly. He handed it to her without speaking. She read it. It was elegantly written, which was its own particular kind of threat. The language was smooth and reasonable. It extended what it called a final opportunity for private resolution, an offer to purchase the Weston Ranch at a price it described as fair and reflective of the property's current market value given the existing legal uncertainty around the water rights. It noted with apparent regret that territorial court proceedings of this nature were lengthy and expensive and created operational difficulties for ranching operations during the period of dispute. At the very end of the letter, written in the same measured, reasonable tone as everything that had preceded it, was a paragraph about Marin. It expressed hope that she was settling in comfortably, that the adjustment of arriving as a stranger to an unfamiliar community was going smoothly, that the recent discussions in town about the nature and circumstances of the Weston marriage had not caused her undue difficulty. It noted that Aldous Crane had always found it regrettable when innocent parties were caught in the middle of disputes that did not concern them. Marin read that paragraph 3 times. Then she set the letter down. "Tell the boy there will be no response today," she said. Garrett relayed this. The boy left, visibly relieved to be released from the errand. Garrett looked at her. "That last paragraph." "I know," she said. "He's threatening you," Garrett said, "not directly. But that's what it is. He's saying he can make your life in this community difficult. He's identified you as the pressure point." "He has," Marin said. "He thinks if he makes you uncomfortable enough, if he makes you doubt whether you belong here, he thinks I'll either leave or push you toward a settlement," Marin said. "He's wrong." She looked at the letter on the table. "But he's not stupid. He found the thing he believes is fragile and he aimed at it." She was quiet for a moment, thinking it through with the methodical precision she brought to everything that mattered. "He thinks I'm still the woman from the train platform," she said. "The one everyone was whispering about. The one who wasn't enough." She paused. "I need to stop being that woman publicly and completely. Not because I am that woman, because as long as people can be made to see me that way, he has something to use." Garrett looked at her steadily. "What do you want to do?" Marin thought about Harriet's kitchen and the 9 families who had each been dealt the same hand by the same man and had not known it until someone sat at a table and listened long enough to see the shape of it. "I want to call a meeting," she said. "The ranchers Crane has gone after, all of them. I want to hear what happened to each of them. Why? Because if Crane did this to us, he did versions of it to others," she said. "And those others may have pieces of what we need." She looked at Garrett. "A single missing record is a case. A pattern of conduct across multiple holdings is something different entirely. The Federal Commission doesn't just evaluate a transaction, they evaluate conduct, and conduct requires a pattern." Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said Harriet would know who to contact. "Yes," Marin said. "She would." She pulled the ledger toward her and opened it to a fresh page. There was still work to do. There was always still work to do, and she had learned long before Wyoming and Redstone Creek and the Weston Ranch that this was not a burden. It was the thing that kept you oriented when everything else was moving. She began to write. Fletcher Moss hired a lawyer within 2 hours of being served the federal subpoena. Silas Drummond sent word by rider, and the rider arrived at the Weston Ranch on a Thursday morning while Marin was working in the garden with Clem. She read the letter standing in the dirt with her gloves still on, then went inside to find Garrett. He was at the kitchen table with the account books. She set the letter in front of him and he read it, and she watched something in him go quiet the way a fire goes quiet when the wind that has been feeding it finally stops. Moss had confirmed everything. He had been approached in February of 1881 by an intermediary employed by Crane Valley Holdings. He had been paid $940 in 3 installments to remove the 1873 Cedar Springs survey record from the Territorial Land Office files and deliver it to a courier named Davis, employed by Consolidated Western Survey. He had kept the payment documentation because Fletcher Moss was a man who had made a terrible decision for money and had understood in the moment of making it that the only protection available to a man in his position was paper. The chain was complete. Aldous Crane to Crane Valley Holdings to Consolidated Western Survey to Davis to Moss. 5 steps, each one documented. "Will he testify?" Garrett asked. "He's already agreed to," Marin said. "Drummond negotiated a significantly reduced penalty for full cooperation." She paused. "Moss has been living with this for 8 months. I think he's relieved to be done carrying it." Garrett looked at the letter for a long moment. Then he said, "Crane doesn't know we have this yet." "No," Marin said. "He thinks we're still trying to establish how the record went missing through ordinary channels. He thinks we're behind him." She sat down across from Garrett. "We're not behind him." Garrett set the letter down. He looked at her with the expression she had come to understand over these weeks, the one that said he was not as contained as he appeared and never had been. "What does Drummond need from us now?" he asked. "Affidavits from each of the 9 families," Marin said. "A formal deposition from Ezra Pratt. The Moss subpoena results, which he already has." and the compiled analysis of Crane's pattern of conduct across all 9 holdings. She paused. Drummond wrote that he wants to submit my documentation as a formal written exhibit, not testimony, evidence. She held Garrett's gaze. He says it's the clearest presentation of systematic fraud he's seen in a land case. Garrett said nothing for a moment. Is that what it is? He asked. Systematic fraud? That's exactly what it is, Marin said. And now we can prove it. The meeting of 9 families happened 4 days later at the Fenwick Ranch, because Harriet said her table was large enough and her coffee was better than the church halls, both of which were true. Marin had expected 5 or 6 families. 9 came. They represented between them nearly 14,000 acres of land that bordered Crane's holdings or contained water or mineral rights he had shown interest in over the preceding 6 years. They came with the energy of people who have been carrying something alone for a long time and have just discovered they are not alone after all. Marin listened. She listened the way she listened to everything, with the full attention of someone who understood that the most important information was usually not the first thing a person said, but the thing underneath it. The shape of what had actually happened, rather than the shape of how it felt to have it happen. She tracked, connected, and found the architecture beneath the surface of 9 different stories that were, she understood within the first hour, the same story told 9 different ways. Aldous Crane had a method. He began with documentation. Every time, without exception, he found or manufactured a discrepancy in the original filing, missing records, disputed boundaries, survey accuracy called into question. He used it to create legal uncertainty, to file motions, to make the future feel unstable and expensive and impossible to navigate without resources most ranching families did not have. Then he made an offer. The offer was always fair, not predatory on its face, not the offer of a man who wanted to be seen as a villain, the offer of a man who wanted to be seen as a reasonable solution to an unreasonable situation. Fair enough that a family staring at years of legal uncertainty might reasonably decide that the land was not worth what holding it was going to cost them. 2 families had taken the offer. They sat at Harriet's table with the specific silence of people who had made a decision they could not unmake and had been living inside that decision ever since. He knew you'd take it, Marin said. She said it without accusation, with only the flatness of someone stating a fact. He designed the pressure specifically to bring you to the point where the offer felt like relief. The timing, the amount, the language of the legal threat, all of it was calculated to land at exactly the moment when you had the least resources left to resist. She paused. That is not opportunism. That is a system. Can we prove it's a system? Asked Amos Walsh, who had been fighting Crane over mineral rights for 18 months and had the exhausted quality of a man who was close to the end of his rope and knew it. We can document it, Marin said. Every case, every filing, every offer, every surveying company he used, every date. Pattern of conduct across 9 holdings with the same methodology is not coincidence. It is a scheme, and the Federal Land Commission has authority to investigate systematic fraud against land grant holders. She looked around the table. I want to compile everything. Every motion he filed against each of you, every irregularity he claimed, every offer he made, dates and amounts and names. The room was quiet. Then Margaret Carey, whose family had taken Crane's offer 6 months ago, a small, precise woman who had said very little since arriving, reached into the bag she had brought with her and set a stack of papers on the table. I kept copies, she said, of everything. I didn't know why. I just kept them. Another woman set papers on the table, then another, then a third. The women of the valley, Marin understood as the stack grew, had been keeping records, not because anyone had told them to, not because they had a legal strategy. Because they had lived with uncertainty long enough to understand that documentation was the only hedge against it that actually worked. Marin looked at the papers accumulating in the center of Harriet's table, and something moved through her. That was not triumph because they were nowhere near finished, but something adjacent to it. The feeling of a shape emerging from what had looked like scattered pieces. Garrett, sitting beside her, reached under the table and briefly pressed her hand. She did not look at him. She squeezed his hand once and let go. Here's what we do, she said, and she laid it out. The second letter from Aldous Crane arrived the following Monday. It was addressed to Garrett, written in the same elegant, measured language as the previous one. It noted that Crane had become aware of certain meetings taking place among valley ranchers and expressed concern that outside influences were encouraging legal action that would prove costly and ultimately unsuccessful for all parties involved. It renewed the offer to purchase the Weston Ranch, this time at a slightly higher figure, framed as a gesture of continued goodwill. The final paragraph mentioned Marin. It expressed, with apparent regret, that questions were being raised in the community regarding the circumstances of her arrival and the nature of her background, and that he hoped such questions would not cause her undue distress, and that he personally felt it was unfortunate when community trust was undermined by arrangements that, whatever their legal standing, were not fully transparent to those involved. Garrett read it and handed it to Marin without speaking. She read it and set it on the table. He's going to move against you publicly, Garrett said. Before we can bring this to the commission, if he can damage your credibility in this community, he damages the testimony of everyone who has been working alongside you. I know, Marin said. You are the connection between all 9 families, Garrett said. If he can make people see you as an unreliable outsider, the coalition falls apart into 9 separate disputes again. I know that too. She was quiet for a moment. We need to go to town together. And we need to keep going to town and to church and to every community occasion between now and the commission hearing. Not to perform anything, just to be present and visible and consistent. She looked at him. People need to see what this household actually is, and what is it? Garrett asked. Marin held his gaze. Something real, she said. They drove into Redstone Creek that afternoon, and Garrett drove at the pace of a man who had nowhere to hide and no intention of hiding. Marin sat beside him with her hands in her lap and her spine straight and her eyes on the road ahead. At Garfield's Mercantile, Garrett placed the November household order with the complete normality of a man conducting ordinary business. Marin read the items from her ledger while Garfield wrote them down with the focused attention of someone grateful for something uncomplicated to do. 2 women in the store watched. Marin noted them and continued reading from the ledger. At the bank, the teller looked between them with barely concealed surprise, as though he had expected something different from this particular visit. At the feed store, Harlan Briggs saw them and nodded at Marin with the subdued courtesy of a man still navigating his own history with her. And then, because Marin had thought this through, they went to see Reverend Aldgate. Aldgate was genuinely glad to see Garrett in a way that was unmistakably real. The warmth of a man who had watched someone he respected close himself off from the world, and had never stopped hoping to see him return to it. He shook Garrett's hand and then looked at Marin with the careful attention of a decent person trying to take an accurate measure. Mrs. Weston, he said, I've been meaning to come by the ranch. I'm afraid I've let too much time pass. Not at all, Marin said. Garrett tells me you've known each other since he was a boy. Aldgate's face did something complicated with happiness. Since he was about 12 and convinced he could break every horse in Wyoming before winter, he said. He looked at Garrett with obvious affection. He's somewhat more patient now. Somewhat, Garrett said, and the dry quality in his voice, the near humor that Marin had come to quietly value, was there for Aldgate to hear as well. They stayed 20 minutes, long enough for the conversation to be real rather than performed. Walking back to the wagon afterward, Marin said, he'll say something from the pulpit Sunday. Not about any of this directly, Garrett said, but about community, about fair judgment, about what a town owes the people who live in it. He paused. He's been wanting a reason. Marin looked at him. You knew that before we went in. I grew up here, he said simply. She thought about that. About the long history beneath 4 years of withdrawal. About the relationships and knowledge that had gone quiet but not away. Garrett Weston had resources she had not fully accounted for, and they were not the kind that appeared in a deed box. What else haven't you let on? She asked. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, the judge assigned to Crane's territorial filing, Judge Caraway. He and Crane have done business together for 6 years. Drummond flagged it early, which is part of why I was relieved when you suggested the Federal Commission angle in the barn. Marin stopped walking. Crane picked his judge in advance. Yes. He built this to run through a compromised court, she said, because he controlled the outcome before the first motion was filed. She looked at Garrett. But he didn't account for the commission angle, because to get to the commission, you need evidence of systematic fraud across multiple holdings. And he didn't think anyone would be able to put that together. He didn't think anyone would try, Garrett said. He looked at this valley, Marin said, and saw isolated people with isolated problems. He didn't know that 9 families had been keeping records at their kitchen tables. She turned and kept walking, and he didn't know Harriet Fenwick would introduce me to all of them within a month of my arrival. Garrett walked beside her. He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding whether to say something. He didn't know you, he said finally. She did not respond to this, but she held it. Aldous Crane called the community meeting on a Thursday. Word reached the Weston Ranch by midday through Clem, who had heard it in town from the blacksmith, who had heard it from the hotel clerk. Crane was calling a gathering at First Methodist for the following evening. He was presenting what he called a community address regarding the federal interference in territorial land matters. Marin was in the kitchen when Clem told them. She stood very still for a moment. He's going to make his move at the meeting, she said. Yes, Garrett said. He's going to attack me publicly, in front of the whole community at once, with enough authority that it's harder to recover from than anything he could do privately. She paused. He's calculating that if I'm not there, he tells the story to an empty chair. And if I am there, he's gambling. I won't be able to respond effectively in public. Garrett looked at her. Do you want to go? Yes, she said without hesitation, especially knowing what he's going to say. If I'm not there, he defines me. If I'm there, he has to say it to my face. She held Garrett's gaze. And he doesn't know what I know. He doesn't know I have been hearing versions of what he's going to say my entire life, and I am still standing. Garrett was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, we go together. Yes, she said. We go together. The hall was fuller than Marin had ever seen it. Word had traveled fast and far, the way significant things traveled in Redstone Creek, and people had come with the alertness of a community that knows it is about to witness something that will be discussed for years. Marin felt the weight of their attention the moment she and Garrett walked through the door, the shift of it, the collective registering of their arrival together. She found Harriet and Bertram near the left wall and moved toward them. Harriet took one look at Marin's face and said nothing except to make room. Aldous Crane stood at the front of the hall. He was exactly as Harriet had described him. Silver-haired, impeccably dressed, carrying himself with the ease of a man who had never entered a room and not been received on his own terms. He had two men with him. One Marin did not recognize. The other was the man who had stood at the end of the South Road with a notebook. He saw Marin come in. Something moved through his expression, quickly managed. He had not expected her to attend. She noted that. Reverend Aldgate opened the meeting with visible discomfort, said something about community dialogue and respectful exchange, and sat down looking at his hands. Crane spoke for 20 minutes. He spoke about the Federal Land Commission investigation as an overreach of federal authority into matters that properly belonged to territorial governance. He spoke about the importance of community self-determination. He spoke about the costs and uncertainties of federal proceedings for ordinary ranching families. He was smooth and reasonable and compelling in the way of a man who had spent 30 years being exactly those things in rooms exactly like this one. Then he turned to Marin. "I think this community deserves to know something," he said, with the measured regret of a man about to say an unfortunate but necessary thing, about the woman who has been at the center of this legal campaign. The hall went completely silent. Crane said that Marin had arrived in Redstone Creek 2 months ago as a mail-order bride from Chicago, that she had come from circumstances that were difficult to verify, that the matrimonial agency through which the arrangement had been made had a documented history of irregularities, that the representation she had made of herself to that agency had not been entirely accurate. He said he raised this not to harm anyone personally, but because the community had been encouraged to trust and follow a woman whose background was uncertain, and people deserved to make informed decisions. He looked at Marin as he said the last part. Marin stood up. The movement itself caused a ripple in the room. Garrett put his hand on her arm and she felt the difference immediately, not restraint but presence, the warmth of someone standing with you rather than holding you back. She stepped into the aisle. "Reverend Aldgate," she said, "may I respond?" Aldgate looked at her, then at Crane. Then with the decision of a man who had been looking for a reason to do the right thing and had just found it, he said, "Of course, Mrs. Weston." Marin turned to face the room. Every face, every pair of eyes. Every person who had whispered on the platform in October or fallen silent at the Mercantile or wondered, in the way that small towns wonder about newcomers, whether she belonged here. She had thought about this moment for 2 days. She had prepared language and revised it and prepared it again. And then the night before, she had set all of it aside, because the only thing that had ever worked for her was the truth, and the truth did not require preparation. It only required the willingness to say it out loud. "Mr. Crane is correct that I submitted a photograph to the Chesterfield matrimonial agency that was not mine," she said. Her voice was clear and it carried. "I knew about it, and I permitted it, and that was wrong. I told Garrett the truth before we had been an hour on the road from this station. He made an informed decision to proceed." She paused. "What Mr. Crane has not told you," she said, "is that this characterization of my background has no relationship to a survey filed in 1873. It has no relationship to water rights, or to missing land office records, or to a company called Consolidated Western Survey, which his own holding company created and controls." She looked around the room at the faces she had come to know over 2 months. "What it has to do with is this. He has run out of ways to fight the evidence against him, so he has decided to fight me instead, because he looked at me when I arrived in this town and decided I was the weakest part of this household. Very quiet, very complete quiet. He was wrong about that," Marin said. "But I understand why he thought so. I arrived here with one suitcase and a borrowed photograph, and nothing to recommend me that anyone in this room could see on the surface." She held the room. "The people who have worked alongside me in the past 2 months know what I actually am. I'll leave the judgment to them." She sat down. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Harriet Fenwick stood up. "I have known Marin Weston for 2 months," she said. "In that time I have watched her build a legal case against systematic fraud that 12 years of this community's individual efforts failed to build." She looked at Crane with the directness of a woman who had been waiting for this specific opportunity. "I have also watched Aldous Crane pay a government clerk $940 to make a survey record disappear." She sat down. Amos Walsh stood. "He offered me $14,000 to walk away from land my grandfather built," he said. 3 days after the filed record of our boundary survey mysteriously developed problems in Cheyenne. He sat down. A woman named Clara Hendricks, whose family Marin had met at the Fenwick table, stood briefly. Same method, different property, different year. She sat down. Margaret Carey stood slowly from the back of the room. She had come quietly and taken a seat near the door, and Marin had not expected to see her tonight at all. "My family took his offer," Margaret said. Her voice was steady. "We took it because we had no choice. And Marin Weston came to my house 2 days ago and didn't say one word of judgment. She just asked if she could still use our documentation." She paused. "She could have made us feel ashamed. She didn't." She sat down. And then Harlan Briggs stood up. He stood slowly, the large, deliberate movement of a man doing something that did not come easily to him. He did not look at Marin. He looked at Aldous Crane, and his voice when he spoke had the quality of a man who had decided something and was going to say it regardless of what it cost him. I said something unkind to this woman the day she arrived in Redstone Creek, he said. Something I had no right to say and no excuse for saying. I have been aware of that ever since. He paused. I am not going to stand in the church I attend every Sunday and watch someone else do worse. He sat down. Then Garrett stood up. Nobody had expected this. In 4 years, Garrett Weston had not spoken publicly about anything that was not cattle prices or fence lines or the technical business of men who worked land. He did not look at Crane. He looked at the room, at the neighbors he had grown up alongside, at the men and women he had known his whole life and had in the years after Iris quietly stopped allowing himself to see. I know exactly who I married, he said. His voice was low, and it carried the way his voice always carried, without needing volume. I knew before the wagon left this station on the 3rd of October. Marin told me the truth before we had been an hour on the road, and I made my decision knowing everything there was to know. He paused. Anyone in this town who wants to question that marriage is welcome to start by explaining why they said nothing when Aldous Crane was buying their neighbor's land one disappeared record at a time. He sat down. The room was completely silent. Aldous Crane stood at the front of the hall with the expression of a man watching the ground shift beneath his feet. The smooth, polished surface was still there, 30 years of managing rooms like this one. But underneath it, something had gone rigid with the tension of someone whose plan has failed in a way that cannot be salvaged in the moment. Reverend Aldgate closed the meeting. People moved toward the doors with the quiet of people who have witnessed something significant and are still processing what it means. Marin sat still while the room emptied around her, and Garrett sat beside her, and when most of the others had gone, he turned to look at her. I had more prepared, he said. She looked at him. What were you going to say? That anyone who questioned your right to be here would answer to me, he said. That I had a list of every man in this valley whose fence I had repaired for free, whose cattle I had helped find in a storm, whose debts I had quietly not collected on. He paused. I had intentions. Marin looked at him. You didn't need the list. No, he said. They didn't need to hear it from me. They needed to say it themselves, she said. For it to mean something, it had to come from them. Garrett looked at her for a long moment, and what was in his expression was something that had been building for weeks, something that lived underneath the flat gray surface and was no longer entirely contained by it. Marin, he said. Garrett, she said. I need to say something to you, he said, and I need you to not immediately turn it into a conversation about legal strategy. She waited. I love you, he said. That is what I need to say. I did not plan to. I did not expect to. But you are the most remarkable person I have encountered in my life, and I should have said this before tonight, and I am saying it now. He said it the way he said everything, without performance, without volume, with the weight of something that had been carefully considered and was completely meant. Marin looked at him in the nearly empty church hall in the candlelight with the sound of Redstone Creek continuing outside and the cold smell of October air coming through the gaps in the door. She had spent 26 years being told in word and gesture and deliberate omission that she was not the woman someone chose, not the one people looked at twice, not the face anyone remembered, not the name on the list, not the woman worth staying for. She looked at Garrett Weston, who had picked up her suitcase on a train platform when everyone was whispering, who had sat with her until past 10 over a deed box, who had driven into town slowly and without apology, who had said all right in a barn and meant everything. I know, she said quietly. I've known for a while. Is that all you're going to say? He asked. She considered him. I love you too, she said. I have been attempting not to on the grounds that it was impractical and premature. It is impractical, he said. Yes, she agreed. Does that change it? No, she said. It doesn't change it at all. Garrett reached over and took her hand. He held it the way he had held things he valued, with both hands, fully, the way he had not held anything in 4 years. Marin let him. Outside, Redstone Creek made its ordinary sounds. And inside the church hall, something settled into place that had been working its way there since a train arrived 40 minutes late and a woman stepped onto a platform holding a heavy suitcase and refused to lower her eyes. The Federal Land Commission hearing was set for December 3rd in Cheyenne. They went the day before, Garrett and Marin and Silas Drummond, and they sat in Drummond's office until 10 in the evening, going over the presentation for the last time. Marin had spent 3 weeks on the written submission, 42 pages organized by date and holding, with a summary analysis that laid out Crane's pattern of conduct with the clean logical structure of someone who had been thinking about nothing else for 2 months. Drummond read the final version the night before the hearing. This is better than most legal briefs I've filed, he said. Your filings gave me the model, Marin said. I paid attention to how you structure a factual argument. Drummond looked at her for a moment. I'm going to choose to take that as a compliment. It was meant as one, she said. In the morning, Garrett knocked on her hotel room door and said through the wood, breakfast in 20 minutes. She said she would be there, and she was, and they ate without talking about the hearing because everything that needed to be said had been said, and what remained was only to go in and do it. The hearing room was formal and not large. A long table at the front for the three commissioners, Drummond's table on one side, Crane's three lawyers on the other. Ezra Pratt was already seated when they arrived, his leather folder on his lap, his back straight. He nodded at Marin and she nodded back. The lead commissioner was a woman named Margaret Holloway. Marin had not known this in advance. She absorbed it without showing anything, but she felt something in her steady in a way it had not been steady before. A woman in that position in that room in 1881 had arrived there by being unassailable, and unassailable was exactly what Marin needed across that table. Drummond presented the case with the precision of someone who had been preparing for this specific hour for 2 months. He laid out the chain cleanly, the Western water rights, the missing survey record, the consolidated Western survey connection to Crane's holding company, the Moss testimony, the Pratt affidavit. He submitted Marin's written analysis as Exhibit 14. Crane's lead attorney, a large man named Carver who moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to winning, challenged everything methodically. The Moss testimony, he argued, came from a compromised witness. Marin's analysis was a lay document from a party to the proceeding. The Pratt affidavit conflated field notes with official filed records. Commissioner Holloway overruled 2 of the 3 challenges without visible hesitation. On the third, she looked at Marin's submission and said, "This document is admitted as the factual compilation of a party to the proceeding. Counsel's objection is noted." Carver moved to the photograph. He raised it without making it grotesque, which Marin recognized as the more dangerous approach. He noted that Marin had submitted false documentation to a matrimonial agency and suggested the commission weigh accordingly the testimony and analysis of a woman who had demonstrated willingness to misrepresent herself. Commissioner Holloway looked at Marin. "Mrs. Weston, you may respond." Marin stood. She had prepared language. She had revised it. The night before she had set it aside entirely and decided to say only what was true because the truth did not require rehearsal. "I submitted a photograph that was not mine to a matrimonial agency," she said. "I knew about it and I permitted it. I told my husband the truth before we had been 1 hour on the road together. He made an informed decision to proceed." She paused. "I would like to suggest that what I did with a photograph has no logical connection to whether Aldous Crane paid a government employee to remove a survey record. Those are 2 separate facts. Conflating them serves one purpose, to make this commission look at me rather than at the evidence." Commissioner Holloway wrote something down. "Thank you, Mrs. Weston," she said. "You may be seated." Carver was on his feet. "I'd like to." "I believe the response was sufficient," Holloway said, in the tone of a woman who ended things when she decided they were ended. "Please proceed to your next point." Beside her, Drummond exhaled. Ezra Pratt testified for 40 minutes and was unshakable. He had his father's field notes open before him and walked through every measurement, every marker, every notation with the thoroughness of a man whose professional life had been built on accuracy and who understood exactly what was at stake. When Carver pressed him on whether field notes could be considered as reliable as officially filed records, Ezra said with the patient clarity of a professional addressing a layman's misunderstanding, "The official filed record is derived from the field notes. The field notes are the original document. What was removed from the Cheyenne Land Office was a copy. The original has been in my office for 8 years. The hearing room went very quiet. Carver said, "No further questions." Fletcher Moss testified last. He looked diminished, the diminishment of someone who has been carrying a bad decision for 8 months and has finally set it down. He answered every question carefully, accurately, with the precision of a man who had been told by his own attorney to say exactly what was true and nothing more. At the end of his testimony, he said, unprompted, "I want to say that I knew what I was doing was wrong. I told myself it was just a piece of paper and no one would be hurt. But I knew." He looked at the table. "I'm sorry for it." Commissioner Holloway said, "Thank you, Mr. Moss." The afternoon session was Crane's defense. His expert surveyor presented an alternative analysis of the Cedar Spring boundaries, suggesting the markers had been placed incorrectly. He was professional and specific and considerably more dangerous than anything else Crane's team had offered. Drummond cross-examined him for 20 minutes. He asked which maps the surveyor had used for his analysis. The surveyor named them. Drummond submitted into evidence a letter from the Wyoming Territorial Survey Office, obtained 2 weeks earlier on Marin's suggestion, stating that the 2 maps cited had been revised in 1878 to correct a drafting error in the original 1871 editions, and that any analysis based on the pre-revision versions would show a systematic eastward displacement of approximately 300 yards. The hearing room was very still. "Were you aware of the 1878 revision when you conducted your analysis?" Drummond asked. The surveyor's composure held, but it was working to hold. "I may not have had the updated editions," he said carefully. "You may not have," Drummond agreed. "Or you may have been provided the older edition specifically so your analysis would reach a particular conclusion." He let that sit for 3 seconds. No further questions. Marin had found the 1878 revision reference in a footnote in a territorial survey report 6 weeks earlier. She had written in the margin, "Important, check opposing surveyor's source materials." She had given the page to Drummond the following morning. She did not look at Crane. She kept her eyes on Commissioner Holloway and watched the lead commissioner write something long and deliberate in her notes. The hearing concluded at 4 o'clock. Holloway said the commission would issue its ruling within 15 days. The ruling came on the 14th day. A federal courier arrived at the Weston Ranch on a Thursday morning, and Garrett brought the envelope in from the yard and set it on the kitchen table, and they stood on either side of it for a moment. That held everything the past 2 months had been. Then Garrett handed it to Marin. She opened it. She read it once. She set it on the table and looked at Garrett. The commission finds in favor of the Weston water rights, she said. The 1873 survey is validated in full. The Cedar Spring boundaries are confirmed as originally recorded. She paused. The commission is referring the matter of the missing survey record to the federal attorney's office for criminal investigation of Aldous Crane and Consolidated Western Survey for fraud against territorial land grant holders. Garrett stood very still. All 9 holdings, he asked. All 9 holdings are included in the referral, Marin said. The commission has issued a temporary protection order on all disputed properties pending the criminal investigation. The kitchen was completely silent. Then Garrett sat down. He sat the way a man sits when the weight he has been carrying is suddenly no longer entirely his, and the muscles that have been compensating for it for months do not immediately know what to do with the absence of it. Marin sat across from him. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then Garrett said in a voice that came from somewhere deep and real, "My father built this ranch from open land. He filed that water rights claim himself. He stood in a field in 1873 with Thomas Pratt and watched him set those markers." He stopped. He would have. He stopped again. Marin did not fill the silence. She let him have it. "He would have liked you," Garrett said finally. "He would have said you were the most practical woman he had ever met, and he would have meant it as the highest compliment he knew." Marin looked at her hands on the table. She thought about a man she had never met who had built something worth protecting. About a woman she had never met who had planted roses and believed that things coming back were simply what things did. About a town that had whispered about her on a platform in October and had stood up in a church hall in November. About all the distance between those two things and what it had taken to cross it. "Write to the 9 families," she said. "They should hear it from us before the formal notice arrives." "Yes," he said. He did not move yet. She gave him the moment. The news moved through Redstone Creek the way significant things move through small places, fast and unstoppable, reaching every corner before the day was out. By Friday morning, everyone knew. By Friday afternoon, Amos Walsh had written to 3 neighboring ranches. By Saturday, Harriet had organized something at the Fenwick property that was not quite a celebration and not quite a meeting, but was somewhere between both, with too much food and too many people and a fiddle player who arrived without being invited because he had heard something worth playing for. Marin stood near the door at one point in the evening and watched the room. She watched Amos Walsh laugh for the first time since she had known him. She watched Margaret Carey stand with her husband with the posture of 2 people who had been through something hard and were still standing together on the other side of it. She watched Clem in the corner eating pie with the focused seriousness of someone who considered the task important. She watched Harriet, who caught her eye across the room and smiled the smile of a woman who had told someone to build something solid and had watched them do exactly that. She watched Garrett. He was talking to Reverend Aldgate with the real engagement of someone present in his own life, not the performed civility of a man going through the motions, but actual presence, actual investment. Aldgate was saying something, and Garrett was listening with the attention he brought to things that mattered. And then he said something back, and Aldgate laughed, and Garrett's face did the thing Marin had come to quietly love, the slight shift that meant he was pleased about something and was not going to say so. Then he looked up and found her across the room. He looked at her the way he had been looking at her for weeks. Fully, without the flatness that had been there at the beginning, with the quality of a man who sees someone clearly and has decided that what he sees is where he wants to be. He crossed the room to her. "How are you?" he asked. "Good," she said, "really good." He stood beside her and they looked at the room together. "Harlan Briggs is crying," Garrett said. Marin looked. He was right. Harlan Briggs, large and standing near the food table, was working very hard to appear as though he was not, with limited success. His wife was patting his arm. "He was frightened," Marin said. "I think he believed Crane would win and there would be no way to undo it. A lot of people here were frightened." "Yes," Garrett said. "Fear is quiet," she said. "You don't always see it until it lifts." Garrett was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I have something to ask you." She looked at him. "We married as a practical arrangement," he said. "That was what it was, and I don't say that to diminish it, because the practical arrangement became what it became and I would not trade any of it." He paused, finding his way through it with the care he brought to things that mattered. "I want to ask if you would marry me as something else. Not instead of that. Alongside it, in the spring, in the church. With Harriet and Aldgate and all of them there." Marin looked at him. "I want it on record somewhere," he said, "that this was a choice. That I chose you and you chose me, knowing everything with both eyes open." She thought about a train platform and a borrowed photograph. About a woman who had spent her life being the one who wasn't chosen. About deed boxes and federal statutes and rose canes with roots that went deeper than anyone could see from the surface. About all right said in a barn in October, meaning everything. Yes, she said. I'll marry you again. Garrett took her hand. He held it the way he always held it, completely, with the particular warmth of a man who had decided this was real and was not going to pretend otherwise. Across the room, Harriet Fenwick watched this and said something quietly to Bertram that made him smile into his coffee cup. The criminal investigation into Aldous Crane ran through the winter. Moss testified under formal immunity. The courier Davis was identified and brought in. The connection between Crane Valley Holdings and Consolidated Western Survey was documented and entered into the federal court record. Drummond filed a civil suit on behalf of all 9 families. Crane fought every step. He was patient and well-resourced, and he made them earn every inch of ground. There were weeks in January and February when the process stalled in ways that made Marin's jaw tight and the evenings at the kitchen table longer than they needed to be. But the chain held. It held because Ezra Pratt's field notes were unimpeachable. It held because Moss never wavered. It held because Marin's compiled documentation had been thorough enough that there was nowhere to hide a discrepancy. It held because 9 families had signed statements and not one of them withdrew. In March, Aldous Crane accepted a negotiated resolution. He did not go to prison. He was too well connected for that, and Marin was honest with herself about the limits of what the law could reach in 1882. But he divested completely from Crane Valley Holdings, paid restitution to all 9 families, surrendered his interest in the Redstone Territorial Bank, and was permanently barred from any land dealings in Wyoming Territory. He left Redstone Creek in April. Marin was in the garden when word came. She did not go to watch him leave. She was on her knees beside the rose canes in the southeast corner, the 2 replacements from the Laramie nursery that had arrived in March, pressing soil around the base of the second one. And when Clem came to tell her, she looked up and said, "Good," and went back to what she was doing. Clem stood beside her for a moment. "Mrs. Weston," he said, "when you started all this, when you first sat down with the deed box and started asking questions, did you know it was going to work?" Marin sat back on her heels and thought about this honestly. "No," she said. "I knew it was the right thing to do." "That's different from knowing it would work." Clem considered that. "But you did it anyway." "Yes," she said. "Why?" Marin looked at the roses. Both the original canes, showing new growth now, tentative and red at the tips, and the 2 replacements settling into the soil they had been given. "Because the alternative," she said, "was accepting that a man like Aldous Crane gets to decide what things are worth. What land is worth, what people are worth." She paused. "I have never been good at accepting that." Clem was quiet for a moment. "Me neither," he said. She looked at him sideways. He was 20 now, had aged in ways she could see across the months they had worked alongside each other. "No," she said. "I didn't think you were." The second wedding was on a Saturday in May, when the Wyoming spring had finally committed to being spring and the light lasted long into the evenings. Reverend Aldgate performed the ceremony in First Methodist with more warmth than he had managed for many weddings, which he later admitted was because he had been waiting 4 years for Garrett Weston to be present in his own life again and had been quietly afraid it would not happen. Harriet sat in the front row and cried openly and made no apology for it. Bertram sat beside her and handed her his handkerchief and looked at the ceiling. The 9 families were there. Clem was there, cleaned up in a way that suggested considerable effort, standing in the back with his hat in his hands. Harlan Briggs was there with his wife, standing straight, with the bearing of a man who was taking the occasion seriously and was glad to be in the room. When Reverend Aldgate asked Garrett if he took this woman, Garrett said yes in the way he said everything, without performance, without volume, with the specific weight of something that had been carefully considered and was completely meant. When he asked Marin, she said yes clearly and directly and without the hesitation of someone who expected to be contradicted. Garrett placed his mother's ring on her finger. He had told her about it the week before, asked if she minded, said his mother had been a woman who valued people who worked and did not need to be admired. Marin had said she did not mind at all, and she had meant it entirely. After the ceremony, Harriet found Marin near the door and held her in the decisive way of someone who had made up their mind to do it and was doing it fully. "I told you," Harriet said. "Build something solid." "You did," Marin said. "And you did." Harriet pulled back and looked at her with the direct warmth she had had from the very beginning. "I'm proud of you, Marin. I want you to know that." Marin held that for a moment. "Thank you," she said, "for the first cup of coffee and everything after." Harriet waved it off. "That's what people are for," she said. Then, because she was incapable of staying entirely serious. "Also, you made Garrett Weston attend a social event which I had given up on entirely, and for that alone you have my permanent gratitude." Months later, in early October, a girl named Nora Walsh found Marin in the garden on an afternoon that held the first real suggestion of winter to come. Nora was 10 years old and had the serious face of a child who took information literally, and she had been following Marin around for several weeks with the focused attention of someone conducting a long study. She sat on the garden wall and watched Marin work. "Mrs. Weston," she said, "were you sad? When you came here and people said things about how you looked?" Marin sat back on her heels. She thought about the train platform, which felt like a very long time ago and like last month simultaneously. About the whispers that had moved through the crowd before she had set her suitcase down. About the long history of being the one people looked past. Yes, she said. I was sad. But you didn't act sad, Nora said. No, why not? Marin looked at the girl. At the serious face, the literal attention, the genuine wanting to understand. Because the people who were saying those things had already decided what I was, she said. And if I acted the way they expected, if I lowered my eyes or apologized or walked away, then everything they had decided would have been correct. She paused. I was not going to let them be correct. Nora thought about this carefully, the way she thought about everything. What if they had been right? What if nobody ever changed their mind? Marin looked at the roses. Both the original canes and the two replacements from the Laramie nursery, all of them showing the deep red growth of plants that had found their conditions and decided to stay. The southeast corner, where the morning light came best. Iris Weston had known what she was doing when she put them there. Then I would still have known who I was, Marin said. And that would have had to be enough. She looked at Nora. But they did change their minds. Not all of them. Enough of them. And the ones who mattered most they saw clearly from the beginning. Nora looked toward the house where Garrett had come to the back door to say something to Clem about the evening's work. Mr. Weston, she said. Yes, Marin said. Nora nodded with the decisive certainty of a child arriving at a conclusion. He's good, she said. He is, Marin said. Did you know that when you came? Marin thought about a man who had picked up a heavy suitcase and said, I didn't pay for a picture, I paid for a person. About gray eyes that saw clearly from the first moment. About a barn in October and 2 words that meant everything. Not exactly, she said, but I knew there was something worth staying for. Nora seemed satisfied with that. She slid off the wall and went toward the house where the Walsh children were playing in the yard. Garrett appeared at Marin's shoulder a few minutes later, in the way he appeared, quietly, without announcement, simply there when he was there. What was she asking, he said. Whether I was sad when I first arrived, Marin said. What did you say? The truth, she said. He was quiet for a moment beside her. Are you sad now? Marin looked at the garden, at the house that had been a building and was now a home, at the roses that had been dead canes and were now something that would come back every spring, deeper rooted each year, more certain of themselves, less troubled by the wind, at the life that had assembled itself around her, piece by deliberate piece, out of necessity first, and then out of something that had no practical name but was more durable than necessity and more honest than anything she had planned for when she walked into the Chesterfield Matrimonial Agency on a Tuesday afternoon in Chicago with $7 in her purse and no door left to open but that one. She had been wrong about what she would find on the other side of it. She had thought she was looking for a way to survive. She had found something worth living for instead. No, Marin Weston said, I am not sad, and she never was.